Donald J. Trump just walked straight into the hostile heart of the Washington establishment, looked Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson dead in the eye, and completely dismantled a 40-year political illusion on live television. Do you honestly believe, Mr. Trump, that a heavily politicized ruling can legitimately wipe out 40 years of hard-earned civil rights protections? The words sliced through the dense, humid atmosphere of room 2141 inside the Rayburn House office building. Her voice was clinical, cutting, and dripping with absolute Ivy League arrogance. Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson leaned in close, pressing her fingers flat against the mahogany wood, her eyes locking onto the witness table with pure defiance. The packed committee room held its collective breath. Blinding camera flashes fired off rapidly, capturing a confrontation the corporate press promised you would never see. Donald J. Trump did not even flinch. He casually reached for his water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and placed it back down with a heavy thud that echoed louder than the chairman's gavel. That familiar, knowing smirk crept onto his face as he leaned right into the microphone. His voice blasted through the tension like a freight train. 40 years of protecting civil rights, or 40 years of using skin color to manufacture safe seats for your political party? Justice? The room instantly erupted into a chaotic, low rumble. Reporters desperately hammered away at their keyboards, while congressional aides furiously whispered into their devices, "Welcome to reality." This is the real world the mainstream media tries to bury every single day beneath a mountain of virtue-signaling garbage. Think about the blinding irony unfolding right now in the nation's capital. For decades, the elite narrative shoved down your throat on every nightly broadcast was that America had to fight racial discrimination by actively practicing racial discrimination. They lectured you, claiming the only path to fairness at the ballot box was to meticulously divide citizens, packing them into neat little identity politics boxes based purely on their race. But tonight, that grand illusion is shattering. It is breaking right in front of us, and the panic on the radical left is absolutely historical. The shadow machine exposed. The darkest secret of the Washington establishment is finally bleeding out under the unforgiving fluorescent lights of this congressional hearing. Over half of the Democrat power structure in the House of Representatives has just been outed as a totally artificial, legally rigged house of cards. Their political dominance never came from superior policies. It did not come from an economic boom, and it certainly did not come from winning over the American voter. It was born from a calculated, decades-long geographical scam that treated human beings as nothing more than partisan voting blocks, designed to be packed, stacked, and manipulated. Jackson aggressively adjusted her glasses. Her posture went completely rigid as she realized her opening ambush had not pushed the former president back a single inch. The Clay ruling is a highly dangerous act of judicial activism that fundamentally threatens minority representation in America. "Mr. Trump," she fired back, projecting the rehearsed authority of someone who always gets the last word. Her voice dominated the audio feed. "We are discussing Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, an essential shield designed specifically to ensure black and brown voters are not marginalized by a white majority." Trump let out a low, rumbling chuckle. It was a sound that instantly told everyone in that room he had her exactly where he wanted her. He leaned back, spreading his hands in that classic, disarming gesture that totally neutralized her stiff legal jargon. "Oh, I know all about your shield, Justice Jackson," he replied. "But let's be totally honest for a minute, because the American people are watching, and they are completely sick of the games." He paused. He let the massive weight of that statement hang in the dead air, his eyes slowly scanning the row of stunned Democrat lawmakers. "Your shield was never about protecting anyone. It was always about production, producing guaranteed political monopolies where your party never had to earn a single, solitary vote. Justice Jackson's face went flush red under the bright studio lights. Her hand gripped her pen so tightly, her knuckles turned bone white. That is a deeply cynical, baseless accusation that insults the integrity of the federal judiciary and the millions of citizens who rely on vote dilution standards. She hurled the academic phrase like a weapon, relying on intimidating elite language to force him into submission. But this audience does not get bullied by Harvard vocabulary, and neither does the man sitting at the witness table. You see, that is exactly where you are wrong, and that is exactly why your entire party is absolutely terrified of what happened yesterday, Trump shot back. His tone turned ice-cold and razor-sharp. He leaned in, his shadow creeping across the desk, preparing to tear down 40 years of institutional hypocrisy in one breath. You brand it vote dilution. You brand it civil rights. But the citizens of this nation are finally waking up to the ugly truth behind your terminology. The silence inside room 2141 was deafening. You could literally hear the electronic hum of the monitors broadcasting this bloodbath to millions of homes. You built a multi-billion-dollar grievance machine. It is designed to keep the country divided, keep them furious, and keep your friends in permanent political power. The academic fortress crumbles. Jackson opened her mouth to object, to hide behind the safety of procedural committee rules, but the momentum was completely gone. The narrative had slipped through her fingers, and the master negotiator was just warming up. Still, she refused to back down. She slammed a massive leather-bound binder down onto the desk. The heavy thud vibrated straight through the audio system. Her eyes, calculating and fierce behind thick frames, swept the room with an icy dominance. This was her battlefield. This was a world of constitutional precedents where she had spent her life crushing opponents. She unclipped the binder, exposing hundreds of pages of highlighted statutes, census figures, and legal briefs. To her, Trump was just an unruly witness, begging to be crushed by the supreme weight of federal law. The mainstream press leaned in, fingers hovering over their laptops, praying the liberal lioness was about to strike back. Let us pivot away from political rhetoric, Mr. Trump, and speak directly to the actual text of the law governing this republic, she stated. Her voice was steady, crisp, and dripping with institutional prestige. She flipped to a heavily marked page. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is not up for casual debate, nor is it a partisan tool you can dismiss with a cheap catchphrase. Pinning Trump with her gaze, she slipped into the lecture mode of a seasoned academic. The law explicitly commands that no voting prerequisite shall be applied by any state to deny the right of any citizen to vote on account of race. She paused, desperately trying to let the historic gravity sink in. For 40 years, our courts have understood true equality is impossible if minority populations are systematically buried by a hostile geographic majority. Flipping to a new tab, she revealed a complex, multi-layered map of the American South. This is precisely why majority-minority districts are a constitutional necessity, an indispensable mechanism for democracy. She aggressively traced a red boundary with her silver pen. Without these engineered districts, black voters in the South and Native voters in the West are entirely stripped of their constitutional voice. They are entirely incapable of electing candidates if forced into districts meant to dilute their power. Her expression hardened into a rigid mask of judicial righteousness. The VRA guarantees these communities a real seat at the table. It ensures racial justice. If we do not redraw maps in places like Mississippi, the black vote will be effectively stolen by the white majority. The Democrat members nodded along in total synchronized approval. This is not a scam. It is the supreme law of the land, protecting the vulnerable from the tyranny of the majority. She closed the binder, leaning back with supreme confidence. Thoroughly convinced, She had just built an impenetrable fortress of legal precedent. The room waited for Trump to explode. But he didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw a fit. He didn't even blink. Instead, a quiet, deeply amused smile spread across his face. It was the lethal smile of a man watching his enemy step right into a massive snare. Resting his forearms on the table, his blue eyes flashed with a dangerous, mocking brilliance. "Ah, vote dilution," Trump said. His voice dropped into a smooth, casual rhythm that totally shattered the room's tension. He shook his head, a soft laugh escaping him as he stared at her massive binder. What a truly beautiful, incredibly creative concept that is. He looked dead into the main network camera, talking directly to the hard-working Americans at home. "Keep going, Justice Jackson, please. Because I really want to hear exactly how you and your friends define this wonderful piece of legal creativity." The pure sarcasm in his delivery was so thick it completely gutted her academic authority. Her eyebrows instantly knitted together. Her jaw tightened as the realization hit her her grand, historic lecture had been treated as a total joke. "This is not a creative concept, Mr. Trump. It is a proven legal standard, validated by decades of Supreme Court precedent before your appointees arrived," she snapped. Her elite composure was cracking. She frantically flipped back to her notes, her fingers gripping the paper with subconscious terror. "Look at the evidence. Look at the recent decisions out of the Southern District of Mississippi." She pointed aggressively at her brief, desperately raising her voice to regain the psychological high ground. A 3-judge panel explicitly ruled that Mississippi diluted the black vote, denying citizens equal representation. She glanced up, eyes flashing. With a frantic need for control, the NAACP sued because real American citizens were marginalized by a system refusing to give them a fair map. She kept going, her speech accelerating to bury him under case files. "Look at North Dakota, where the 8th Circuit had to examine Native American legislative districts." Slamming her palm onto the paper, her voice echoed sharply off the marble. "The pretext is always the same. A systemic dilution of minority power caused by an overwhelming concentration of white voters in their historic territories." She locked eyes with him like a furious prosecutor. "These are real legal injuries recognized by the Constitution. You cannot simply laugh away the suffering of these communities because it does not fit your political narrative, Mr. Trump." The master of the deal strikes back. The silence crashed back into the room, but the entire atmosphere had fundamentally mutated. The audience saw right through the elite rhetoric. They knew the master of the deal was about to rip the mask completely off. Trump sat perfectly still, his confident smile totally unwavering. He casually reached out and tapped his microphone twice. It was a dominant, alpha gesture, signaling her presentation was officially over. "You see, that is the whole problem with you people from Harvard. You think if you write a very long, very expensive legal brief, the American people will not notice the scam," Trump stated. His voice was devastatingly calm. He crossed his arms, staring at her not as a supreme legal scholar, but as a dirty politician caught red-handed in a backroom hustle. "You talk about the law. You talk about Mississippi. You talk about North Dakota, using all these beautiful, high-sounding words like racial justice." He shook his head with pure, unadulterated disgust for the institutional lie. "But what you are really doing, what your party has been doing for 40 years, is running the biggest, most corrupt gerrymandering machine in the history of the world." Jackson immediately tried to object, her hand reaching for a gavel she did not possess. "Mr. Trump, you are out of order. You cannot insult the integrity of—" "No, I am not out of order, Justice Jackson. You asked the question, and now you are going to listen to the exact answer." Trump bulldozed over her. His voice dropped into a heavy, crushing wall of sound that completely obliterated her interruption. The committee chairman sat entirely frozen, letting the raw political massacre play out on national television. "You want to talk about Mississippi? Let's talk about Mississippi," Trump commanded, taking total control of the oxygen in the room. That lower court did not care about fairness. They cared about manufacturing another guaranteed safe Democrat seat because your party is rapidly losing the working class. He leaned forward, his massive frame dominating the desk. "Every single time you people lose an election, you don't change your terrible policies. You don't try to help normal people. You just run to a friendly federal judge and beg them to redraw the map." He paused, letting the brutal truth echo through the stunned chamber. "You use the Voting Rights Act as a political weapon to protect your friends, secure your donors, and keep your radical left-wing agenda alive on life support." Jackson sat totally paralyzed, her lips pressed into a thin, pale line, as her academic armor was entirely pierced by a direct populist strike. The corporate press began whispering nervously, finally realizing their hand-picked champion was bleeding out. "You call it protecting the vulnerable, but the American people are incredibly smart. They see the exact coordinates. They see the actual numbers, and they are sick of being lied to," Trump concluded. His voice rang out with unmistakable authority. He flashed that confident MAGA smile, knowing the foundation of the left's 40-year empire was visibly cracking wide open. Jackson's fingers clenched her silver pen so aggressively, the metal clip groaned. Her eyes were blankly fixed on the chaotic Mississippi map, but her mind was transported far away from the Rayburn building. That desperate physical reaction unlocked a deeply hidden vault of institutional memory the establishment had spent decades trying to bury. To comprehend the sheer terror freezing her veins, you have to look behind the curtain. You have to go back to the smoke-filled back rooms of the late 80s and early 90s. You have to look at the exact moment the radical left shadow architects discovered their ultimate political gold mine. Before that era, parties actually had to work for a vote. They had to debate inflation, national security, and true American prosperity. But a select cabal of far-left strategists, map-makers, and race-based data architects realized they could completely bypass the messy business of actually convincing voters. They looked at demographic data from the Census Bureau and found a permanent backdoor to unassailable power. They realized that by weaponizing Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act under the fake guise of civil rights, they could legally force state legislatures into becoming their personal map-carving tools. The literal recipe for this partisan sausage was simple, highly effective, and deeply cynical. They called it packing and stacking. This corrupt formula didn't require a booming economy. It didn't require safe streets or a message that resonated with working-class families. All it required was high-tech software and a total, absolute disregard for human dignity. They used specialized computer programs to isolate every single black and brown neighborhood across a state. They deliberately herded them into a few carefully twisted, highly concentrated voting districts. They packed minority voters into artificial boundaries until the district was mathematically guaranteed to elect a Democrat every single time. Absolute certainty, zero competition, zero accountability. By doing this, they created political fiefdoms, where radical politicians held power for decades without ever delivering a single result for their communities. And the most brilliant part of the scam was the cover story they fed you. If a conservative legislature tried drawing a normal map based on county lines, the left's legal enforcement arm, backed by the NAACP, instantly filed a massive federal lawsuit. They would march into a friendly court, look directly at the cameras, and cry that the lack of racial packing was an act of voter dilution. They weaponized the sacred history of the civil rights movement, turning a struggle for legal equality into a routine corporate shakedown to manufacture safe seats. Politicians like Joe Biden quietly funded and cheered this shadow machine, knowing it was the only thing keeping their party relevant. They built a permanent pipeline where identity politics completely replaced actual governance, reducing the American voter to a mere racial statistic on a spreadsheet. The ultimate truth bomb back, in the hearing room. The high-pitched hum of the cameras seemed to roar. Trump watched her intensely, noticing the slight tremor in her hand, reading her body language like a world-class poker player. He didn't wait for her to recover. He didn't let her hide behind another wall of legal jargon. He cleared his throat directly into the microphone, his voice cutting through her internal panic like a blinding lightning strike. The American citizens sitting at home tonight, the ones who actually pay their taxes and love this country, they really need to know exactly how you and your friends have been making the sausage in Washington for 40 years, Trump declared. The words hit the panel like a sledgehammer. You don't want to talk about the reality of what you did, but I am going to tell them, because the game is officially over. His tone was conversational, yet vibrating with unyielding power. He turned his head to face the mainstream journalists, frantically whispering in the press box. You people took the most sacred thing we have in this democracy, the vote, and turned it into a corrupt corporate manufacturing plant, Trump said, his finger tapping the table to emphasize every single syllable. You didn't want to go out there and convince people that your radical, open border, high-tax ideas were good for their families, because you knew you would lose. You knew you would lose badly. He paused, his face twisting into profound disdain as he looked back at the pale justice. So what did you do? Your top strategists, your mapmakers, your deep state architects sat in dark rooms with census data, and they engineered a permanent victory. His voice dropped into an intense, low rhythm that captured the undivided attention of the entire planet. You herded American citizens into specialized geographical pens based entirely on the color of their skin, packing them together like numbers on a corporate spreadsheet. The Democrat lawmakers began shifting violently in their leather chairs, completely unable to meet his eyes. You created these artificial, twisted, ugly districts that look like monsters on a map, just so you could guarantee a permanent, untouchable majority, totally immune to normal political competition. He made a sharp carving motion in the air. You turned these communities into your own personal property, assets owned by the Democrat Party, where you never had to fix the failing schools, never had to bring back the jobs, and never had to lower the sky-high crime. Jackson's vocal cords strained to find some shred of academic theory to protect the machine. Mr. Trump, that is an entirely uncharitable and legally inaccurate description of remedial racial districting under established civil rights law, she managed to stutter out. Her voice was tight and visibly buckling under the intense pressure. The courts have repeatedly held these measures are necessary to cure the systemic exclusion of minority voices from Congress. Trump let out a loud, mocking laugh that bounced right off the high marble ceiling. It was a sound of pure populist derision that instantly deflated her fake authority. Remedial districting? Is that what they call it at Harvard? Because back in Queens, we call that a fixed fight. We call it a rigged deck of cards, Trump fired back. His eyes narrowed as he drove the point through her chest with absolute precision. You can call it whatever beautiful, expensive name you want, but the American people are not buying the lie anymore. They see the coordinates. They see exactly what you did. He leaned even closer to the mic, his massive presence fully absorbing the room. You used race to divide this country. You weaponized the law to protect your own absolute power, and you turned millions of great American citizens into nothing more than a permanent partisan voting bloc. He shook his head, a cold, triumphant smile returning to his face. But yesterday, my appointees on the Supreme Court took your 40-year sausage factory. They took your corrupt maps, and they blew them right out of the freaking water. Jackson desperately gripped the edge of her desk, leaning in close to reframe the entire debate. What we are seeing with the Clay decision is not a triumph of constitutional consistency, Mr. Trump. It is a raw display of conservative judicial activism, she stated, calculating every syllable. This court has taken a tool meant to guarantee equal access and turned it into an instrument enforcing a reverse form of discrimination against historically marginalized communities. She hurled the phrase like a heavy shield, trying to paint the conservative majority as a radical, partisan force dismantling civil rights. The corporate journalists prepared to write the headline that the liberal icon had cornered the MAGA leader. But Donald J. Trump simply raised his eyebrows, completely calm, anticipating the definitive kill shot. He refused to let her build a complex web of legal lies. His voice boomed throughout the public address system. Justice Jackson, I just have one very small, very simple question for you, and I think the whole country would love to hear a straight answer for once, he said, the words dropping like heavy iron weights. The suffocating tension stretched until the silence was absolute. Have you ever noticed how this incredible, creative concept you call vote dilution only ever seems to apply to minority, non-white voters? Trump asked, dripping with razor-sharp irony. He looked directly into her soul, entirely stripping away the formal pretense. It only ever goes in one direction, doesn't it? It is never applied the other way around, is it? Jackson's face went instantly pale. Her elite composure totally vanished as she desperately opened her mouth. Mr. Trump, that is a fundamentally flawed interpretation of the 14th Amendment and the core purpose of Trump threw his hand up with absolute, undeniable authority. It was a sharp, decisive strike that utterly silenced her. No, excuse me. You talk all day about fighting racial discrimination. You lecture us about fairness and equality, he countered, his heavy, unyielding cadence filling every corner. But the brutal truth is, you are using actual, blatant racial discrimination against white voters just to force states like Mississippi to manufacture more safe Democrat seats. He slammed his open hand down onto the witness table. The sharp crack echoed off the marble like the gavel of public opinion. That is not justice. That is a disgusting, shameful display of absolute hypocrisy wrapped up in the expensive robe of federal law. The room instantly erupted into gasps and frantic, terrified whispers. The raw reality of the left's entire operational strategy was completely stripped naked before the nation. The moral foundation of the progressive elite crumbled into dust in real time. For 40 years, they lied to you. They claimed they were the party of inclusion, the party that wanted equal voices. But the second you rip back the curtain and look at the actual mechanical reality, you find the most cynical double standard in American history. They engineered a corrupt system where the law itself was weaponized to discriminate against one group under the fake pretext of helping another, all to maintain a permanent stranglehold on power. They told legislatures that if a district had too many white voters, it was an inherent violation of federal law. They weaponized fairness to justify targeted exclusion based purely on race, creating a legal weapon that literally only struck one target. Jackson sat rigidly, her eyes wide with a massive mixture of shock and sheer anger. The standard for vote dilution requires demonstrating a history of polarization and exclusion. Mr. Trump, it is a remedial measure recognized by the highest courts, she said. Her voice was visibly shaking despite her desperate attempt at detached demeanor. It is not discrimination to ensure historically denied communities finally participate equally in the democratic process. Trump let out a short, completely dismissive laugh. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated contempt for the institutional spin. Equal participation? Is that what you call it when you tell a sovereign state they have to legally rearrange their borders just to guarantee a specific partisan outcome? He asked. His eyes narrowed as he drove the blade even deeper. You don't care about participation. You care about protection. Protecting a radical left-wing caucus that absolutely cannot win an honest debate on the actual merits of their garbage policies. He leaned back, gesturing at the row of stunned Democrats, utterly incapable of defending their own corrupt matrix. The American people see exactly what is going on. They see the massive double standard, and they are sick and tired of taking lectures from people who refuse to even follow their own rules. He flashed that unyielding MAGA smile that breaks the establishment's brain. You can hide behind your Harvard degrees. You can hide behind your thousands of pages of legal jargon. But the game is officially up. The golden ticket of the Democrat Party, the absolute ability to use race-based gerrymandering to protect your fake majority, was just totally destroyed by a court that actually believes in the United States Constitution. Jackson sat in a heavy, oppressive cocoon of absolute silence, her eyes glued to the wood grain as the grand architecture of the progressive legal movement fractured fatally. To the casual viewer, she was just enduring a tough hearing, but if you looked at her rigid shoulders, you saw the profound isolation of an insider realizing her entire universe was rapidly collapsing just outside that room. The panic beyond the walls. While the cameras focused on the table, a chaotic, historical wave of sheer, unmitigated terror was ripping through the private signal chats and luxury donor lounges of the entire left-wing establishment. Just hours prior, behind heavily guarded glass doors, the crown jewel of the identity politics machine had fully shattered. Stacey Abrams, the high priestess of race-based electoral engineering, was pacing her office in absolute terror. Her controversial organization, Fair Fight, rumored to be floated by massive dark money networks, was now a command center of pure desperation. For years, Abrams traveled from studio to boardroom, demanding maps be drawn on racial lines. But the moment the Clay decision roared down from the Supreme Court, her corporate-funded empire was exposed as a hollow, totally defenseless fortress. Emergency donor calls were frantic. Staffers desperately tried explaining how a multi-million-dollar legal shield completely vanished overnight. Abrams was blasting out panicked Substack warnings, crying with a level of total vulnerability her media allies prayed the public would never see. She was loudly screaming that the downstream consequences of Clay were not just a minor setback, but the total, permanent liquidation of the entire Democrat pipeline. And it wasn't just her sounding the alarm. Deep inside the ACLU headquarters, the mood was an absolute funeral. Lawyers who spent 40 years weaponizing courts to micromanage local elections were forced into a devastating internal admission. In urgent technical reports, they explicitly admitted the Clay ruling was a tactical nuclear weapon. They openly warned this precedent did not stop at Congress. It was an institutional wrecking ball aimed directly at the entire local infrastructure of the progressive movement. Every state legislative district carved to protect radical politicians was now legally dead. Every county commission district, mathematically engineered for a progressive majority, was entirely indefensible. Every school board district racialized to protect woke bureaucrats from angry parents stood on unconstitutional ground. Every city council map from Atlanta to Chicago, drawn under the weaponized Section 2, was now a ticking legal time bomb. The left spent 40 years building their entire farm system on artificial racial geography, and with a single, devastating 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court cracked it from the absolute top to the absolute bottom. Back in the hearing, a sudden murmur broke out. A congressional aide quietly passed a printed copy of the latest Fair Fight panic report to a senior Democrat. The lawmaker's face instantly drained of all color. His fingers trembled as he scanned the massive projected losses of hundreds of local seats. Trump watched this subtle interaction with the sharp eye of an apex predator who knew exactly when his enemy was totally defeated. He let out a loud, booming laugh that cut through the stuffy air like a blast of freezing wind, shattering the fake solemnity. He leaned directly into the microphone, locking eyes with the pale, sweating Democrat members, avoiding his gaze. Your golden girl, Stacey Abrams, is out there right now, completely losing her mind on national television and screaming from her Substack because she knows the massive gravy train has officially derailed, Trump declared, his voice infecting the room with a sense of total victory. He pointed an accusatory finger right at the internal memos. Why do you think she is panicking so hard? Why are all your dark money legal groups crying about a routine constitutional ruling? He demanded, his mocking interrogation dominating the space. He paused, letting the heavy blade hang over them before delivering the undeniable truth. It is because the entire corrupt, race-based engineering matrix that you people spent 40 years building, from your local school boards all the way up to your city councils, has just been totally broken from top to bottom by the Clay ruling, Trump shouted. His voice echoed off the high ceilings. The heavy silence proved their shadow machine was entirely exposed to the daylight. They didn't build a party on patriotism. They didn't build a coalition on lower taxes, safe streets, or American excellence. They built a fortress of toxic racial division, a high-tech tribal system designed to stop the working class from uniting against the corrupt managers of Washington. They thought they could operate a rigged deck of cards forever. But the exact moment a courageous, colorblind standard was reapplied to the Constitution, their multi-billion-dollar apparatus turned straight to ash. Jackson closed her eyes. Her hand froze over her pen as Trump laid out the total strategic bankruptcy of her movement. The shield failed because it was fundamentally hollow, fundamentally un-American, and completely indefensible under a real court. She let out a cold, defensive breath, desperately trying to shift the conversation back to sterile bureaucratic safety. Adopting a dismissive, highly technical tone to downplay the historic magnitude, she stated, Mr. Trump, let us be entirely accurate about the procedural reality of what occurred on May 18th. Her words dripped with icy detachment. The actions taken by the Supreme Court were merely routine procedural orders, what we call GVRs, or grant, vacate, and remand orders. She offered a thin, terribly patronizing smile to the panel. This is simple bureaucratic housekeeping, an administrative mechanism to clear dockets, not some grand structural revolution. She radiated a rehearsed indifference, praying the millions watching would buy the lie. The corporate press immediately caught her cue, fingers flying to spin the narrative and shelter the establishment. But Trump just chuckled, a deep, menacing rumble that instantly froze the frantic typing in the gallery. He didn't hide behind elite vocabulary. Instead, he reached into his dark suit jacket and pulled out a crisp, extremely heavy packet of official, certified data documents. They bore the undeniable headers of Ballotpedia and the United States Census Bureau's 2024 American Community Survey. He didn't just lay them down. He slammed the massive stack onto the wooden table. The deafening crack echoed like a literal lightning strike. You call this routine administrative housekeeping? Trump demanded, his voice dropping into a terrifying wall of sound that completely shattered her weak narrative. He pinned her with a fierce, unyielding gaze, his hand flattening against the data. Look at the actual data. Look at these undeniable, certified numbers right here on this paper. He leaned directly into his mic, preparing to deliver a fatal dose of mathematical reality to the entire progressive structure. There are exactly 148 congressional districts in the United States House of Representatives that were drawn explicitly with race as the predominant factor under your corrupt, weaponized standards. He paused, letting that staggering number crush the lawmakers on the dais. If you want to do some very quick, very basic math, That is a full one-third of the entire United States House of Representatives. Jackson's patronizing smile instantly vanished. Her face turned stark white. Trump's voice grew intensely quiet, dark, and filled with a sense of imminent doom for the radical left. And out of those 148 engineered districts, your party is currently sitting on 122 seats. He leaned even closer, boring directly into her soul as he exposed the ultimate structural secret: 122 seats. That is more than half of the Democrats' entire 212-seat House caucus, sitting on maps that the Supreme Court just declared completely suspect and unconstitutional. He slammed his fist onto the table again, the raw populist power silencing the massive building. More than half of your entire party's congressional power was built on a foundation of corrupt, race-based geography that has just been completely condemned by the law of the land. The Democrats looked like they had just seen a ghost, staring at the official census data, dismantling their political future in real time. The left never built a majority on persuasion. They built an empire on racial gerrymandering, herding human beings into specialized boxes to guarantee survival. They thought they could hide behind terms like GVR orders, but the moment the undeniable data is dragged into the light, their 40-year monopoly completely evaporates. Jackson frantically reached for her notes, fingers shaking, desperately searching for jargon to salvage her shattered composure. Mr. Trump, those numbers reflect historical efforts to remedy systemic exclusion. They do not mean those seats are illegitimate under current statutory frameworks, she stammered, completely losing her elite, clinical edge. You are mischaracterizing a complex demographic reality to create a false narrative of political corruption. Trump let out a short, biting laugh, shaking his head with absolute disdain. The only thing that is false is the idea that your party can survive without a rigged deck of cards. He forcefully pushed the document further across the table, forcing the cameras to zoom in on the devastating breakdown. The numbers don't lie. The data does not care about your Harvard theories, and the American people are finally seeing the absolute truth. He stood firm at the witness table, a colossus of populist reality watching the progressive legal apparatus bow under the crushing weight of hard facts. Jackson swallowed hard. The clicking of her pen stopped as she desperately scanned the empty chairs, searching for a single, sympathetic ally. She sat completely exposed, visibly trembling as she reached for her mic one last time. Mr. Trump, you are intentionally trying to create a false narrative of division within the highest court to serve your populist agenda, she argued, straining to project a fake aura of academic solidarity. The progressive wing remains entirely committed to constitutional equity, and no single ruling will ever break our shared dedication to protecting the disenfranchised. She threw out the phrase, shared dedication, like a fading lifeline, pretending an army of brilliant liberal minds stood behind her robe. The broadcast truck scrambled for a split-screen angle, desperate to find any visual supporting a unified liberal resistance. But Donald J. Trump gave them absolutely nothing. His casual posture vanished as his blue eyes locked onto her with the absolute freezing coldness of a prosecutor delivering the final, fatal verdict. You talk about your progressive wing, Justice Jackson, and you lecture this country about your wonderful judicial solidarity. But I want you to take a real good look around this room tonight, he stated, dropping heavy steel weights into the absolute silence. He paused, letting the suffocating tension stretch across the floor until the only sound was the quiet hum of the cameras. Look, right behind you, because the certified reality that you absolutely cannot lie your way out of is that the vote was 8-1, Trump shouted. The staggering numbers echoed off the marble walls like a massive thunderclap, 8-1. You aren't leading a movement. You are sitting all by yourself on an island that is rapidly sinking straight into the ocean. Jackson's mouth opened slightly, in pure, unadulterated shock. Her face turned totally pale as her own desperate lie was ripped away in front of 30 million citizens. Trump didn't stop. His expression shifted into pure populist triumph as he prepared the most devastating personal blow of the evening. Even Elena Kagan and even Sonia Sotomayor, the people who sit right next to you every single day, the ones who were supposed to be your closest allies, they looked at the hard facts of the Clay ruling and they knew the game was officially over, Trump countered, gesturing sharply at the briefs. They completely abandoned you. They refused to sign your hysterical dissent, and they voted right along with the conservative majority because they actually know what time it is in this country. He leaned even closer, his shadow completely devouring her desk as he drove the final nail into the coffin of her identity politics empire. You are not a civil rights hero protecting the vulnerable. You are just a completely isolated, lonely bureaucrat sitting on a one-woman island, desperately trying to hold on to a corrupt system of racial privilege that has officially expired, Trump declared, his fist hitting the table to punctuate every brutal word. The room erupted into absolute chaos. Conservative lawmakers openly smiled, while reporters frantically ran down the aisles to broadcast the total collapse of the liberal icon. The progressive elite completely betrayed her. When the constitutional clock struck midnight, the left-wing coalition didn't fight for her academic theories of race-based power. Kagan and Sotomayor saw the massive MAGA wave. They saw the undeniable data from the American people, and they chose their own political survival over her radical double standards. They left her completely stranded, writing a lonely, irrelevant dissent that nobody else in Washington was foolish enough to sign. Jackson sat frozen, eyes wide with pure anger and deep humiliation. Her hand trembled against her notebook as she realized her entire legal career was just reduced to a historical footnote of massive partisan failure. The glaring studio lights seemed to dim, casting long, dramatic shadows across the chamber as the heavy reality finally settled. She reached out with a violently trembling hand and quietly switched off her microphone. The sudden click signaled the absolute end of her defense. She sat perfectly still, staring blankly down at the messy pages stretching across her briefs, a stark visual symbol of a fundamentally broken system. Donald J. Trump did not linger. He didn't even look back at the panel of stunned, silent lawmakers who had failed so spectacularly to trap him. He slowly stood up, imposing and towering, calmly smoothing his dark suit jacket and adjusting his signature red tie with the unhurried, dominant confidence of a man who had already won the total war. The corporate reporters sat completely paralyzed, totally unable to spin the raw truth, broadcast live to the Republic. For 40 years, the radical left treated the electoral map as a personal corporate plant, herding voters into pens to protect absolute power. They genuinely believed their dark money networks and corrupted legal interpretations would guarantee a permanent structural advantage forever. But as Trump looked down at the silent liberal icon, he wasn't just looking at the current landscape. He was looking straight at the rapidly approaching horizon. He leaned slightly over the table one last time, his voice dropping into a deep, echoing baritone that cut straight through the solemn quiet like a heavy, final verdict. The tactical maps for the 2026 and 2028 midterms are already locked in, and your top strategists are already weeping over the massive amount of seats they are going to lose, Trump stated, the words falling like heavy anvils onto the dais. A cold, triumphant smile played on his lips as he looked directly into the lens of the main network pool camera. But you just tell your friends over at the DNC to watch the clock carefully, because the year 2030 is coming, and it is coming incredibly fast. He pointed an accusatory finger directly at the stack of Census Bureau documents. When the 2030 decennial census arrives, Every single one of the 435 congressional districts in this country is going to be redrawn from the absolute ground up. His voice grew even more authoritative, resounding with undeniable historical power. And every state legislature in this great republic will be operating under a brand new, supreme constitutional standard that legally dictates you absolutely cannot use race to rig the game. He looked back at Jackson, completely unyielding. When all 435 seats are drawn on a true colorblind constitutional map, the corrupt geographical advantages you've enjoyed for 4 decades will vanish forever into thin air. He leaned in even closer, his massive shadow completely covering her empty desk. The Clay precedent, combined with a clean 2030 census, is not a routine political setback for your party. It is a permanent constitutional checkmate from which the Democrat Party will absolutely never recover. The chamber completely erupted into a wave of hushed excitement as Trump turned on his heel. His heavy, decisive footsteps echoed clearly off the marble walls as he marched straight out of the room. A massive, roaring wave of whispers and hidden cheers followed him from the MAGA congressmen, their faces lit up with the sudden realization that the corrupt old guard had officially fallen. Justice Jackson remained entirely alone on her elevated seat, staring down at the ruined, destroyed pages of her opening statement as the heavy doors of room 2141 violently slammed shut. The massive 40-year empire, built purely on division and identity politics, had just been totally dismantled in a single evening, exposed as nothing more than a desperate, pathetic house of cards. The master of the deal came straight into their territory, used their own certified data to expose their massive double standards, and left them with absolutely nowhere left to hide. The question remains for everyone watching the brutal reality of Washington unfold tonight. Are we currently looking at the literal, undeniable end of the Democrat Party as a viable, functional national opposition? Or will the deep state architects desperately attempt to engineer an entirely new, massive scam before the 2030 census finally arrives to wipe them out? The truth is completely unvarnished. The game has fundamentally changed forever, and the raw reality of American politics will absolutely never be the same again.